Occasionally, a video game series will chug along with decent sales each entry, but then eventually one title comes along and totally blows the lid off of everything, and has mountains more success than anything else that came before it. Some of the games that fall into this category would be Animal Crossing New Horizons, Resident Evil 4, and God of War 2018. But I think the best example of this phenomenon would have to be Final Fantasy VII. Because Final Fantasy VII is a video game, yes, but it's also its own franchise and has almost as many entries as the mainline Final Fantasies. There's spin-off games like Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus. There's mobile games like Ever Crisis. There's movies like Advent Children. And now there's the remake trilogy, which is literally a series within a series within a series. Final Fantasy VII is a super cool world that you can do a lot with, so many fans are rightfully in 7th heaven here. And discussions around this world are seemingly never ending. I'm pretty sure the Tifa versus Aerith debate will still be going on when my grandkids are playing games. But it's also important to recognize the very large shadow that Final Fantasy VII casts over the rest of the series. Even now, Final Fantasy VII Remake outsold Final Fantasy XVI by a huge margin. And yes, while 16 launched on a smaller install base, I don't see it catching up to any of the remake games as more PS5s are sold. Not that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it does put the Final Fantasy series in a bit of a precarious position. No game in the franchise will be able to escape comparisons to 7, and the massive content farm that Final Fantasy VII has become over the last few decades, I think those same seeds are being planted now with Persona 5. So Persona 5 was originally released for the PlayStation 3 and 4 in 2016. It had a re-release with Persona 5 Royal in 2019, which adds a few new things, but I wouldn't call it an entirely new entry in the series. However, since then, Persona 5 has had an absolute swarm of related media come out. There's the rhythm game, Dancing in the Starlight. There's the animated series that follows the events of the original game. There's the Phantom X, a Chinese mobile game that looks to just be Persona 5 again, but with different characters. Why? There's Strikers, an action game which is a sequel to 5, and now there's Persona 5 Tactica, a turn-based strategy game. And so similar to Final Fantasy VII, Persona 5 is now a whole series in and of itself. Obviously, this is great for Persona 5 fans, among which I do count myself. I've been playing Strikers recently after finishing up the original game about a year ago, and it's been great to revisit the Phantom Thieves. And this might sound like a weird comparison, but it reminds me so much of Scooby-Doo. Come on, a bunch of teenagers traveling around in the van, stopping greedy people and solving mysteries, and they have a talking animal. Persona 5 Strikers is probably the highest budget Scooby-Doo game we are ever going to get. But aside from that, it all makes me question the grander scope of the Persona series and where things will go from here. Going back to some games I mentioned that had seen levels of success that had never been before seen by any other entries in their series, there's a common theme with all of them, and that's reinvention. Resident Evil went from being a fixed camera horror series to an over-the-shoulder action one with Resident Evil 4. Animal Crossing New Horizons did away with many of the limitations of previous games, allowing players to customize every facet of their town. God of War 2018 trades Greek mythology for Norse mythology, and famously sheds the old-school hack-and-slash gameplay of the original series in favor of a more cinematic approach. It also moved Kratos away from this gas station employee beard to one that you might see in a fishing gear commercial. And of course, Final Fantasy VII represented a generational leap for the franchise, being the first with 3D graphics, full motion video, pre-rendered backgrounds, and characters that people literally fall in love with. And sticking the landing after these massive reinventions is easier said than done. No game in the Final Fantasy series ever made the impact that 7 did. And Resident Evil 5 reviewed and sold well enough, but was embroiled in a heavy controversy that still follows it around to this day. Too much success can be dangerous, especially when the product that's so successful bulks many of the series' traditions. Future titles are left with an impossible choice: double down on the formula of the breakout hit, revert to how the series originally was and risk losing all the new fans you've just garnered, or reinvent the wheel yet again. Of course, the ideal route would be simply iteration. take what worked in the successful title and expand it while cutting out what doesn't. But again, that's easier said than done. All too often in video games, you see sequels doubling down on poorly received mechanics. Sometimes it can be a misunderstanding about what's good about a game, or it can be plain and ugly stubbornness. If you didn't like it last time, we'll make you like it this time. Not to bring doom and gloom here, but I do think this is a conundrum that the team behind the Persona series is struggling with, and that's why we haven't seen any hint of Persona 6. There was an 8-year gap between Persona 4 and 5, and so if we were to follow that pattern, that would mean that Persona 6 is coming out in 2024. However, I really don't see that happening. Because while Persona 5 might have been released in 2016, it was announced in 2013. So if Persona 6 is really coming next year, I'm certain we would have heard something about it already, especially with how many players are just clamoring to study and take tests as a Japanese high school student again. So instead, Atlus seems to be doing everything except for revealing the next mainline title. They've got Persona 5 Tactica releasing, re-releases of Persona 3 and 4, plus a full-on remake of Persona 3. It's always good to have older titles available for newer audiences, especially if a new coat of paint is needed, so I can't fault them for doing anything with these. But I think the fact that we're seeing all these other projects really shows a bit of hesitancy to move on to Persona 6. And I understand it. It can be daunting to follow up what's not only the most successful entry in the series, but also what's regarded as one of the best JRPGs of all time. Even so long after the game's initial release, it's still getting tons of discussion about things like what's the best dungeon, the demons you can capture, and who the best girl is. And that last part, I find that reductive and a little bit insulting, because it's Makoto, clearly. And whatever form Persona 6 takes, it's never going to be able to escape comparisons to Persona 5. Even though I have full confidence in Atlus to deliver quality again, I can already see the disappointments being aired by fans of 5. So-and-so isn't as funny as Ryuji, the first boss isn't as hateable as Kamoshida, the music isn't as good, the story isn't exciting. It's a no-win situation for the development team. Copy Persona 5 too closely and people will say the game has no new ideas. Change things up too much and they'll complain that it's not more of what they already like. The fact that Persona 5 has been out so long makes things even more difficult. It's a single game that's had such a dominant hold over the identity of the series for years. I'd venture to say that for many people who call themselves fans of Persona, the series starts and ends with Persona 5. And when we do eventually get Persona 6, sometime in the next few decades, I don't see Persona 5 just fading away. I think it'll get the Final Fantasy VII treatment, continuing as its own thing alongside the mainline games. Yes, we'll get Persona 6, 7, and 8, but they might be interspersed with Persona 5 Revengeance, Persona 5 Racing Transformed, and Persona 5 2.8 Final Chapter Prologue. History has a funny way of repeating itself, doesn't it? Much like the Final Fantasy VII Remake games, Persona 5 is becoming a series within a series within a series. The day Persona 6 is revealed will undoubtedly be very exciting, but it'll also be very telling for where the future of the series lies. There's a near infinite number of change-ups they could make to the structure, characters, gameplay, and story to differentiate it from Persona 5, so which ones they choose to go with will be interesting. Sadly, it's almost certain that the game will be divisive on some level. It's impossible to please everyone, and trying to do so usually results in a watered-down experience that's very clearly designed by committee. There's clearly a lot of talent in the team that's behind the Persona series, so I don't have doubts about the quality of the next mainline game. But I will say, I hope they don't hesitate to take risks with the next title. It's better to try something new and not stick the landing versus just playing it safe. That's how we end up with great games like Persona 5, and although I'm a little bit skeptical, I can't wait to see what they have in store for us next.